I mean, listen, the pandemic has set us back immeasurably, or I guess you can measure, but I would say about 15 years, if not more. And I think we were really making progress with women in the workforce. And then the pandemic happens, and 4 times more women left their jobs in the workforce. And it's because they were the first ones that had to take care of their children and their parents. And that it has not even been close to being made up yet. So we have a lot of work to do.
You have talked a lot about the studies and the research that have shown that equal pay for women would add billions of dollars to the American economy. It boosts businesses, it boosts society as a whole. But you've said also that the private sector has a fundamental responsibility to address this issue, that every business needs to take a really hard look at these conversations. As an entrepreneur yourself who's scaled a massive organization and someone who sits alongside some of the world's most influential leaders in business, what actions should CEOs be taking right now to create more urgency and press on this issue in a more fundamental way in their businesses?
I mean, let's just start with saying it's good for business. Women are good investments and they're excellent for business, and they think differently than men. So I think it's very short-sighted for CEOs in any kind of company to think that if they don't have women that are represented at the right percentages, if not in high-level jobs and on the board, it's a big miss, and it's a big miss from a business perspective. So I talk about it all the time to cross categories of all kinds of businesses. And I can tell you, people have to start being accountable, and companies have to start being accountable.
How do you think we can achieve that type of transparency? Obviously, we know it's good for business. A lot of times, though, when companies do audits, the pay audits, it shows that there's still a lot of progress to be made. How do you address that within organizations, or what are the conversations like with the leaders when you press them on this need that's so urgent?
Well, let's start with my own company, because I think that we have to be good examples. So we are doing those audits. We are constantly checking different discrepancies that might come up and fixing them. And I think you have to be on top of it. But I have to say, we're a company that's 85% women. So it's a different environment. That said, I think that we all have to own this conversation, women and men. If it's women just talking about this, we're going to be talking about it for a very long time and not making any progress. So we need men to be actively engaged, partnering with women. And I can tell you, when you talk to fathers about their daughters and the fact that they might be not represented in the same way or paid equally to men, they have a problem with it. So we have to really reset the conversation and make it a conversation that's happening with women and men about women in the workforce. And for once and for all, saying that this is not a favor, it should be a given, and it's good for business.
You make such a great point that this is not sort of an issue. This is not a women's issue. It's an issue for everyone when you don't have this type of equality. Obviously, addressing the wage gap is very complicated. There's certainly no silver bullet solutions. But when you take a look at your own business and the broader business community, can you talk about what you've seen as some of the most effective levers of change that you think others should go deeper on, or that you think are fundamental to be focusing on right now?
I mean, I think we start with, how do we create an environment where women can thrive? And even from the very beginning, Moira, I thought about our company as being flexible, and which is obviously where companies have to think about today. So until we really get rid of the notion that women can either be a mother or have a very significant career, and they can't do both, there will not be equality. So we have to get rid of that stereotype that women have the ability to multitask better than anyone. Women should be should be having families and should be CEOs or any kind of business that they want and not have to pick between the two. So that's one thing that I think that we can have as a company. We can have flexibility where women can come and men, and they take parental leave, which we give. They're able to go to doctor's appointments or lacrosse games or whatever it may be, but they feel safe and they don't feel that they're being judged for being a parent. I look at work as the quality of the work. I don't look at gender. And I think that we all need to start with that as sort of the North Star.
I think that's so important to be talking right now in terms of the need for that flexibility, which has been front and center, obviously, thanks to the pandemic. But the key is to be able to ensure that it creates something lasting within cultures, and organizations and cultures moving forward, because obviously those cultural issues and those biases and those stereotypes are so damaging when we look at what really triggers the pay gap and also just other inequities within the workforce. Before we jumped on to this conversation, you and I had been talking about the fact that this is a discussion that's been happening for many, many years now, and one that's still really frustrating, that we continue to have to beat the drum when there's such an urgency around this conversation. But is there one dynamic to this issue that you think, especially right now, warrants either greater attention or greater focus than you think it's getting within the current set of discussions or solutions that people are putting forward?
Well, I think childcare we need to resolve, and we as a company can't look at it as not our problem. I think it is our problem, and we've lost amazing employees because of that. So whether it's government that steps in and helps with childcare, whether we work on benefits, that's the biggest barrier that is holding women back. And so until they're not the sole person responsible for caring for their children, 60,000 child care centers closed during the pandemic. I mean, that's an astounding number, but the people that are picking up the slack are women and also for their parents and elder care. So that is, I think, the most pressing issue. I think that people in business and the people I admire the most know the value that women bring, and they think differently. Unless you are in a room with diversity of thought, of opinions, of people, you're never going to have an innovative company. And I think that's a mindset that has to change, and I think is changing. One positive thing I think is Gen Z and the younger generations are expecting it. They're holding people accountable. They're more informed. And I think I can say my boys who are late teens and early 20s, they don't see women as being treated differently. It's a given that they're all on the same playing field. And that's a great positive thing. I'm not sure you have a ways to go with your children, but I can tell you with their friends, I see a bit of a sea change.
You have been an amazing role model for so many women and aspiring entrepreneurs, given the business that you built, but also the way in which you've used your platform and your influence to be such a force for progress around equity with female entrepreneurs and women in the workplace. You've talked about this as being, or you described this effort as being deeply personal to you, having experienced some of these challenges earlier in your career, even when you started your own company. Can you talk a little bit about at what point in time you felt compelled that you needed to act and use your platform in a way that was beyond just your company itself?
You know, it's funny. My grandmother used to say, you never learn anything with your mouth open. And I thought that was such an interesting comment. And I learned from that to listen and be curious. And I have to say, growing up with three brothers on a farm, it never occurred to me that I couldn't do what they could do. My parents raised me to believe that I could do anything they could do if I worked hard and put my mind to it. And then going into the workforce, I have to say it was a bit shocking. It was a very different story. And I worked in many different cultures of many different companies. And I always thought that if I started a company, that culture would be the number one thing, and the concept of social responsibility. And I always thought, and this is in 2004, that doing good is good for business. And people pretty much laughed me out of the room at the time. I remember that I also started an e-commerce site, and they told me no one would buy online. So I was not hitting 1,000 at the time. I was pretty much told never to bring up business and social responsibility, and patted on the back a bit and said it was charity work. And I have to say, it just made me more determined. I really just instinctually knew that having a company that does good or could be a platform, and we like to think of ourselves as an activist brand. And I say that word carefully because activism can throw people off, but for us, it's a way of creating positive change. And I am proud to be that kind of company and kind of brand, because for me, it's the ability to reach people, and it's not always people that have the same point of view, but if we can bring people into the dialogue to create change and at least have the conversations, that's something I'm really passionate about.
It's extraordinary to hear you say that that you were talking about social responsibility as being a fundamental to good business in 2004, when those conversations either never happened or it was relegated to corporate response, CSR or some sort of side issue, but it wasn't fundamental in terms of how business leaders created and built cultures. When you look at the work that you've done in building your company and being such a powerful force within the business community around these issues, can you share some of the lessons that you've learned in terms of how to effectively be a force of change? It's one thing to be passionate about another issue. It's another thing to try and move things forward, but it's also a learning process.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge learning process for me. And I have to say, I try to make it as apolitical as I possibly can, because I'm not really interested in the politics of issues on humanity. And so when I stick to issues of humanity is when I think things can really be achieved and get done. And that said, we try to do it in a way that really educates people rather than preaches to people. And I think that to point out discrepancies, to point out inequality, to point out bias and race and issues around tough subjects, I think if you do it in a way that is coming from a place of problem solving, I think that's how you move the needle. We all have to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And I try to not put it in terms of politics, because to me, that's really causing a lot of the problems of today.
It's such a polarizing moment that when you talk about issues and you can't have, to your point, just a conversation, even if you disagree, you really can't move things forward.
Moira, the issue of equality for women, and as far as pay is concerned, should not be politicized. It's half the population, and by the way, it will help with the GDP.
Yeah, I mean, all these business fundamentals. Why do you think it is so politicized, or why do you think still today it's such a charged issue, or one that people know is important, whether it's because it's the right thing to do, or whether potentially it's even a liability down the road?
Well, let's put it this way. I think everything's politicized today. It's hard to find things that aren't. So I do think that people are changing as far as they know that they are going to be held accountable and they need to change. Whether it's coming from the place that they want to change or they have to change, that's to be determined. But I think society and where we are going is going to hold companies accountable. And I can tell you that we all need to do better.
You started the Tory Burch Foundation many years ago as an opportunity to empower women entrepreneurs and women in the workplace by providing great tools and resources and the like. You launched a great campaign, Embrace Ambition, a few years ago as well. When people look at the work that you've done under this dimension of your career, what's the one takeaway, or is there one thing that people can see from the work that you've done that you think is helpful in terms of how they can think about moving the needle forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, one of the things I would say is that they could start moving the needle earlier in the cycle of their success of their business. And I think to have that as part of the onset of the inception of the company is very different. And I think now people are thinking that way. And that is a big, big change. We started the company, as you know, in 2004 and the foundation in 2009. Because we needed, quite honestly, to have the financials to start a foundation, knowing that I wouldn't want to talk about it externally until we had real impact and scale. So it took us many years before we even spoke about it in an external way. I never wanted it to be perceived as marketing. So I guess there's a few things. The other thing I would say, it has to be authentic. A lot of people are just jumping on different issues, and people are savvy. People know, everyone has information, and people like authenticity. That's a big one.
Last question for you, Tory. When people are thinking about how they can be forces of change within their own lives, especially around issues of equity and closing the pay gap and the like, is there one piece of advice that you would give others on how they can think about using their own influence or their voice more effectively to support the causes that we're all so passionate about?
I mean, I say it to myself, I have to be better too. When you are going to ask for a raise, know your worth and know your value and do not compromise. And that is hard. I've struggled with that myself. I've had to really step up and get out of my comfort zone. But I would say we all have to do that. And then we all have to support other people that are doing that as well. We need to be supportive so we can level this playing field we're talking about for way too long.